there's some markets and some cities, I should say, that just don't make sense to be doing business anymore. I know a lot of really earnest, honest owners and investors and property managers who want to be part of the solution, but they're hitting their head against the table because they're tired of being labeled the bad guy, and they're tired of being demonized and called greedy because they're trying to cover their costs, and their costs are going up. Everybody wants to limit their rents more than they can, and without limiting the costs. If you're in a city that I think is open minded and by the way, this isn't red or blue. This is about like just being willing to have conversations. Because I've talked to some people in some cities, they won't even talk to us without yelling at us. So if you're in a city where you can have those conversations, the best advice is a very simple one. It's the same thing about running a business. Is you got to just talk to people. You got to go up to City Hall, meet with the people who are making these decisions, not just the elected officials, but the city staff. Like, they're very influential. Share facts with them. Hey, look, like here's what's going on with taxes and insurance rates and our maintenance costs. Here are the things that we're struggling with. Here's why we had to raise the rent. Like, all of those things, like, they don't know these things. Like, they only know it if you talk to them. And so I think if you make a real effort to build those relationships and put that time in, I mean, that's really, unfortunately, and just educate. I mean, that's what it takes.
Welcome back to Peter Lohman's podcast. I'm thrilled today to introduce Jay Parsons. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
I'm excited to get in a conversation with you about the PM Trends Report, which you co-authored. And you have a really interesting background. You've worked your way through this industry kind of from a different path, but I love the perspective you bring. You share a lot on Twitter about your analysis of the industry and trends and legislation and policy decisions. If you wouldn't mind just taking a couple minutes and give us your backstory on what you've been up to and what you're doing today.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think like a lot of us, unless you grew up in the industry with, parents and family who were, who owned rental homes, I mean, very few of us grow up thinking, man, I'd love to be in rental housing. And I was certainly in that group as well. So I stumbled into it back in the great financial crisis. It was 2008, 2009, needed a job, started off as a research analyst and had no intent of sticking around very long, but, really just fell in love with the industry and a lot of the misconceptions, which I think, some of the things that the survey helps debunk and other things as well. It's, everybody thinks they understand rental housing and quote unquote landlords, which I hate that term, but it's much more nuanced and complicated and in some ways complicated, in some ways it's not, but it's a very misunderstood space, even among investors, who I think have a lot of misunderstandings about it. So I fell in love with that. And then more recently in the last year, I joined a Texas-based multifamily group called Madera Residential, and I continued to do my own kind of independent consulting and speaking for both multifamily and SFR and research as well.
Perfect. Well, let's dive right into the PM Trends Report. So if you're listening and you're like, what the heck is the PM Trends Report? Jordan Muela and I and a couple co-authors got together and engaged with Harris Poll to commission a new survey of rental owners. And we had Harris contact rental owners who are working with professional property management companies and those who were not, and those who previously had. And we had them ask those respondents a billion questions about property management, real estate, rental properties, expectations of property managers, response time. Why do they hire property managers? Why do they fire property managers? How much do they expect to pay? What do they expect to pay for? Just a million questions that we really wanted to know from the mouth of our actual customers, speaking as a professional third-party manager. So we put all this together in a nice report, which was released about a month ago for free to the industry. And here recently, I've just been returning to the report. I was kind of so close to it that I didn't even really have a chance to digest it and internalize the findings. Now that I've had a little time and space, it's been interesting, and I'm coming away with new insights. So we pulled Jay in to help guide the direction of the survey a bit. He's got a lot of experience with large data sets and interpreting results. And so, Jay, as we look over this report, quite clearly it was showing a movement toward professional property management. So back in 2007, 2017, Harris Poll did a similar survey. At that time, about 70% of properties from, that basically multifamily, small multifamily and single family, about 70% were professionally managed, and that dropped to 64% with our 2024 results. So we're seeing a shift here. What do you think is going to be the impact of this shift toward professional management um, on both residents and property owners? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I think taking a step back, I mean, Peter, you know this very well. It's property management has gotten a lot more complicated and difficult. I think especially since COVID, a lot more regulatory pressures on the industry. That's the one part of it, but also the other part of it is renter expectations. This is the you know w- Amazonification of
Yeah.
the consumer today. Like they expect immediate service. They expect to be able to do things online or through apps that traditional sort of mom and pops aren't necessarily equipped to be able to have, and that makes it harder to compete. And we talk, that we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit too, like a lot of issues around maintenance, and so it takes a wide set of skills now to manage properties to the expectations of renters. And that again, plus the more challenging environment, more challenging to be profitable. And I think, the increase of professionalization across the industry has raised the bar for everybody. And so it's like, I think we're seeing kind of two things. Number one is we've seen a lot of smaller mom and pops who've exited the space altogether, or two, they've, taken on these third party management like you're talking about.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that expectation of renters going up. That's definitely true. We're seeing that, throughout this data and other industry data that I've looked at. I mean, I don't necessarily love it as as a property manager. It means I have to keep increasing our speed of response time and our days to repair, and provide more amenities and packages for residents. But I had never really thought about that angle you just mentioned when I'm speaking with a prospective client, a property owner. The idea of bringing up, hey, we're going to help you be competitive for the best residents. We're going to help your home, look and show its best. And we're going to provide reassurances to prospective tenants that you may not be able to offer as an independent landlord. So that's an interesting angle I hadn't considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it's the communication piece. I mean, anybody who's, manages on their own, how difficult that is. Because, again, if you're working on their job, or got things going on, and, someone calls you, you may not be able to get back to them right away. And say people who are full-time jobs who are to take care of these issues. And, I mean, now it's, chats and text messages, everything else that's, it's again, if someone comes from a property that had that before, they're not going to be very happy, having to wait to get back to you, to have someone get back to them because they're have their own job and in a meeting somewhere.
Yeah. So Jay, you currently work and have worked with many large multifamily owners and operators and managers. I'm curious, often thinking about the difference between multifamily and single family, and the industries in some ways are just night and day apart. There's very, very different models, different concerns, but in a lot of ways they're also identical, right? You're renting units to residents. How do you, in your experience, how do you see these larger institutional landlords thinking differently about property managers than the individual property owners that we surveyed? In other words, if you were to take these same questions from the survey here and issue them to institutional SFR owners and multifamily owners, how do you expect the answers would be different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first and foremost, and you alluded to this, Peter, I think the lines are blurring more and more between SFR and multifamily, institutional and sub-institutional. It's like, you know, I think, these rising tides tend to boost all ships, right? I mean, the technology has gotten easier to the point where you don't have to have an infinite budget to be able to support, things like online leasing or whatever. So it's, I think in some ways, like it's been a more level playing field in recent years. In terms of how the differences are, I mean, obviously with an institutional group, is they're really looking for kind of the best practitioners in a given market. Like that's a real priority because they become, I think, like you see in the surveys, investors are increasingly hands-on. Doesn't matter if you're an individual or an institution. When I first got in the industry, a couple of decades ago, it was kind of, hey, give me that monthly and quarterly report and have a meeting. And nowadays, I mean, the expectation is, daily business intelligence data that's going to
Mm.
give them an insight into
How do
what's
we go
going
back,
on.
Jay? Can we go back to how it was?
Yeah, and they're calling you guys, and I mean it's a much more active institutional owner today. Like they're in the data, they're in the business, and they want to be able to catch things fast. And they're communicating, and oftentimes to probably the annoyance of the property managers to try to catch things really early on.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that's trickling down to even the individual mom and pop owners. Um, I'm trying to think in my experience, I've been doing this professionally for almost 13 years now. And I'm trying to like gauge my own experience. Have owners become more involved over time, or have their expectations of update frequency and response time gone up? I think I have to say yes. I think, and you're right. You mentioned like the Amazonification. That is definitely pervasive, and we see that in the responses to the survey. Everything from, you know, response time expectation to a lot of the other details. Where the trend is definitely in one direction for professional property managers.
Absolutely,
Um, yeah,
and I think in the end that's gonna, it leads to kind of a uh, survival of the fittest, right? I mean, the property managers that are really good are going to have more success and get more business, and those that are kind of stuck in the ways of the past. I mean, and people, one thing, Peter, I think is interesting is like people historically get kind of locked into like high touch, high service, versus, all this new stuff. And the reality is, I think, as you know, probably better than me, is that it's a both, right? Like you need to have the personal approach. You need to know your customers, know your investors. But at the same time, as the expectations, like we're talking about, they have increased. They want information faster, and they want resolutions to issues faster too.
yeah, and it seems to me that they're not really willing to pay for those things. Like they're not willing to pay more for higher service, faster responses, higher touch. So we as operators have to find ways to cost effectively deliver those results that our owners want, basically without breaking our business model, breaking our bottom line. And that's our challenge as an industry. How do we structure our company, and how do we pull in the right technology partners so that we can give our owners what they want without breaking our bank?
Yeah. No, that's obviously easier said than done. I think that's one reason why it's hard. I mean, a lot of it comes on the cost side and knowing how to do maintenance well, and obviously that's gotten a lot more expensive. Um, and being able to be efficient without cutting corners.
Yeah. Um, Speaking of that, I want to talk to you about chatting with property owners about specifically like days on market or leasing timelines. So this is something that you pay very close attention to on a nationwide basis. You're always posting great updates to Twitter and LinkedIn about here's what we're seeing for rents and here's what we're seeing for leasing times. Um, how do we talk? The survey actually asked property owners about their expectations for leasing. And to summarize, property owners' expectations of how quickly we should be able to fill their vacancies are not in line with current averages, nowhere close. So how do we talk to property owners about that without making it sound like we're making excuses?
No, I love that question, and I'll tell you, like whether it's multifamily or SFR, the number one challenge. I speak at a lot of investor events, and groups will bring me in and talk to theirs, like dinners and whatnot. And the number one thing I find is unrealistic expectations, and a lot of it stems, I think, from the COVID era, especially that brought in so many new investors in the space, or like recent memory bias, and they start to think like the best of times is somewhat. They're like, oh yeah, I understand that's the best times. But they the benchmark has moved up though, and in reality, as you know, Peter, is like it's cyclical. And I think also too, the thing that's challenging for SFR is everyone sees these headlines in the Wall Street Journal saying, hey, the rent to own gap is the biggest it's ever been. So everyone's going to be renting. And so again, that sets an unrealistic expectation. Like, yeah, the market's fine, but it's not blazing hot. Like
Hmm.
some people sort of intuitively think it should be or it is. And so I think the reality is like, you've got to do a good job of not just investors, they don't want to hear, hey, it's not that hot. I mean, you got to show them data, right? And
Yeah.
that's why I love I'm a data nerd, right? So I'm biased toward data, but there's a lot of great data out there that'll help illustrate some of these points. But if you're just saying on your own and saying anecdotally, like it's not going to solve the issue. You got to show
Yeah.
them external.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to ask you, where can we go to get that data? Specifically, I think the data point I'm interested in is the average days on market for SFR and small multi in a given metro area.
Yeah, there's not as much data on SFR obviously as for multifamily, but a couple of the ones that I like is John Burns Research and Consulting. They do a good job tracking SFR, and they do some surveys that track. I don't know if it's that particular metric, but they do have things that kind of show is leasing momentum and activity, is prospect interest, is it increasing, is it decreasing? And they showed some numbers for their last report showed that leasing activity is down in most markets, and again, I think a lot of investors didn't realize that because of they expected to see better numbers because we weren't buying homes. Another one that I think is starting to be kind of a newer one on the radar is what's the Resi Club? Their new publication, started by Lance Lambert, formerly of Fortune. They've done some surveys and other things as well, where they've got a pretty good pulse on SFR. So not a ton of sources out there, but there are a few that I think are worth looking at.
Love that. Thank you for those resources, and we'll dig up links to those and include those in the description. I think that's going to be really helpful. So speaking of regulations and changes that have made, being a landlord more difficult, which is driving a lot of the movement toward professional third-party management, one of the frustrations I hear from my peers quite often is around these changes, whether it's rent control or any, source of income discrimination protection. There's a lot of things that are affecting in a very real and visceral way our day-to-day operations as property managers, and making things harder or making it feel unfair for our clients who we really identify with. And in many cases, property managers also own rental properties. So the frustration around these things is running high right now. You've got a long history of engaging with some of these policy changes and watching them take shape. What's actually effective for property managers who would like to make an impact on the local, let's ignore federal for the whole podcast maybe, but for state and local rental regulations and legislation, what is actually effective for a given property manager to do?
Well, that's a great question. And I've spent more and more of my time on these type of issues in recent years, again, especially since COVID. And one thing to remember is that it's very rare to unwind things once they start. Once that slippery slope starts, like it's very, very difficult to go backward. And so I think that I'm going to give you two answers. The first one's a bad answer, but it's the truth. The first answer is there's some markets and some cities, I should say, that just don't make sense to be doing business anymore.
Mm,
And I know a lot of really earnest, honest owners and investors and property managers who want to be part of the solution, but they're hitting their head against the table because they're tired of being labeled the bad guy, and they're tired of being demonized and called greedy because they're trying to cover their costs, and their costs are going up. Everybody wants to limit their rents more than they can, and without limiting the costs. And there's some cases where and I won't name names, but there's some cities where it just doesn't make business sense. Like if you want to run a nonprofit, maybe you can do that, but it doesn't make business sense anymore. And ultimately that's going to be to the detriment of those cities, and they're going to learn those lessons the hard way, like a few of them are. Now, the other answer I would say is if you're in a city that I think is maybe that is open-minded and by the way, this isn't red or blue. This is about like just being willing to have conversations. Because I've talked to some people in some cities, they won't even talk to us without yelling at us. So if you're in a city where you can have those conversations, the best advice is a very simple one. It's the same thing about running a business is you got to just talk to people. You got to go up to City Hall, meet with the people who are making these decisions, not just the elected officials, but the city staff. Like, they're very influential. Get in with the city staff, spend time with them, understand their problems, listen, and then let them just share facts to them. Hey, look, like, here's what's going on with taxes and our insurance rates and our maintenance costs. Here are the things that we're struggling with. Here's why we had to raise the rent. Like, all of those things, like, they don't know these things. Like, they don't. I mean, they only know it if you talk to them. And so I think if you make a real effort to build those relationships and put that time in, I mean, that's really, unfortunately, and just educate. I mean, that's what it takes.
Yeah. I'll give you my perspective. Here in Columbus over the last 5 years, there have been a few waves of legislative changes for the city of Columbus specifically. And this affected everything from security deposits to source of income, which is basically we have to take Section 8 now in the city of Columbus, and a variety of other changes to local rental regulations. And the way I responded to all those things, I went to like the first city hall. I attended virtually to like the first meeting about it or whatever. And I was so disheartened by what I saw that I completely checked out of the whole thing and got really frustrated. In retrospect now, what I should have done is there was one specific person who was driving most of these changes and wanted basically legislative victories as it relates to rental housing. She wanted those attached to her name because she had higher ambitions politically, which have now been fulfilled. But she needed a win. She needed to look like she was making a difference for renters in the city of Columbus, and this was how she was going to do it. So, knowing that now, what I should have done is exactly what you said. I should have gone back in time. If I could go back in time, I would go visit with her, and I would get to know her, and I would get coffee with her, and I would be a voice from the other side, not telling her how she was wrong and this is stupid and you need to stop, but just like learning what her desires were and what impact she was trying to make, and then collaboratively coming up with solutions that were going to not be a big pain in the butt, frankly, for us to deal with as an industry and even potentially harm. Because my belief is a lot of these changes actually hurt the very people they're trying to help.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so if I could have helped her see that, does this mean that no painful changes would have been enacted over the last 5 years? Probably not. Like, it wouldn't have been, but it probably would have been better. So that's just a little story from Columbus. Maybe you've got something similar going on in your city. I just encourage you, go reach out. And this is people, right? It's not like there's like 5,000 unidentifiable robots that are making these changes. It's like one or two people usually that are the driving force behind these things. And if you can get in their ear, you could actually make a difference, I think. So,
yeah. No, you're 100% right. And I would just add to that too. It's like, find the people you want to influence, find out who influences them. Like, is it the staff? Is it, somebody in another role? Like, be part of their circle and then, again, try to educate them on the facts, like you said.
I love that. Oh, I got one more question on this topic. You wrote recently about, the source of income discrimination protection, which basically requires property owners and landlords to accept Section 8. You had some really interesting ideas about reforming that a little bit, and I'd love to hear you expound on that, and if you have any other ideas for Section 8 reform, because this is getting more and more painful for us right now.
Oh, yeah. This is a hot topic, and it's tough because, and I just as a brief, I grew up as a kid wanting to be Woodward and Bernstein, do investigative journalism. I spent 3 years as a journalist, and it ended up being horrible. I did not like it, but it wasn't for me. But I still respect those who do. But so I don't want to be those like media haters, but I'll tell you, it's like the media unfortunately does not do a good job covering this topic because it's just positioned as source of income discrimination. And so, and Pete, I know I'm telling you what you already know here, but for anybody who is not familiar with this, just to give you some context here, is that it gets positioned as simply, hey, like, it doesn't matter if a public housing authority is paying the rent or if someone's paying their own checkbook, like they're still paying the rent. That should not matter. And in principle, it's like, I agree with you, right? Like, that's not the issue. Like, who pays the rent? As long as the rent gets paid, not the problem. But the reality is that it's much more nuanced than these headlines give it credit to. And I think a lot of the policymakers too. Number one is, we have a shortage of housing. And if you have to, if you're, when you have a voucher holder, you are basically allowing an inefficiency in the market take place. That unit is going to sit vacant longer
Much
because of the
longer.
much longer. Yes. Yeah. Weeks and not months because of the red tape associated with the voucher process. Now, that's not in anybody's best interest. It's not in the renter's best interest. It's not in the property owner's best interest. It's also not in the interest of other renters who cannot find a place because this place is essentially kind of blocked off with unpaid rent and no one living there for a period of time. That's not good for anybody. So, one of the, and the other thing too is, we'll get into many details here, but it's like, the inspection process is going to be very arbitrary depending on who's doing it and where it is. There's a lot of different issues. And so one of the things that I think is kind of a common sense solution is, hey, like we should, a voucher holder, if you wanted to accept vouchers, like they should have the same rights as a non-voucher holder. They should be able to look at a unit and sign a lease, and that rent should be paid by the PHA, assuming the voucher checks out everything, like the normal background check process, et cetera, and then that gets paid. Now, if the PHA wants to come in later when do inspections, they say find something, then give the renter a choice. And then the landlord says, hey, I can take care of this. I'm not doing that because I don't agree with you. Then they give the renter a choice. The renter could either say, great, I'm okay with it as it is. I'm gonna we'll keep it going, or they can say no. I agree with the PHA. I'm not going to stay in these conditions. Well, then give them a lease break without any penalty. And so there's ways to do this where you can solve these people need places to live. We're making them wait longer. Get them in there if the conditions are acceptable to them. They sign that lease. The PHA pays it. And if they have an issue later, again, don't penalize them if they want to move out for something, but or an issue like that. But it's a common sense solution that I think would be a win to everybody.
Yeah. The local PHA here, which is CMHA, the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority, is the only one in the Columbus metro area. We only have one, and for years now, I've been threatening to start a competitor to them because they're just so bad. They're so bad to deal with, and I don't think a lot of people realize these aren't government entities. They're individually owned and operated, essentially like franchises. They get federal funding through HUD, but they're very much a local, regional type of operation, and you don't need to only have one in your area. You can start a new one. In fact, I downloaded a few PDFs from HUD about how to start a PHA, and it's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, and I kind of put that project on pause. So we'll see.
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, I mean, but unfortunately, they're not known for efficiencies, and there's been various efforts to make these things a little bit better, but it's like, people don't realize how challenging this is. And it's not in the renter's best interest either. It's
Correct.
That's the silly part about all this.
Yeah. All right. Well, returning to the study and the analysis here, I'm curious too. So I'm aware of the Iceberg report from 2017, which also commissioned by Harris Poll and looked at a lot of the same ideas, same questions, and we tried to sort of follow along that path. Are you aware of other studies or data on the individual mom and pop landlords as it relates to property management and SFRs? Because I'm always anxious to take other sources of data and use that to improve our analysis or extend our understanding of trends.
Yeah, no, there's so SFR, especially because it's so dominated, contrary to headlines again, by individual mom and pops. It's very, there's a lack of data. I know Buildium, a good technology provider, they've done some surveys of their customer base, and there's some interesting things in there. But generally speaking, there's not a lot of stuff like this. So it's great to see surveys like what the Harris Poll put together here.
Yeah, I started looking at some survey data. I'm sorry, census data. There's a couple of things that the census, the federal census, seems to put together every few years, using data reported by, maybe it's like Fannie and Freddie, or I don't know how they get this data, but it's like 2 clicks in and you're already downloading like tables of Excel. I'm not equipped to really analyze that level, to that level. So have you ever looked into any of this, or how should we think about that?
I'm not sure what sense data you're referring to, but yeah, it could be cumbersome to walk through. I mean, there's obviously data on things like, they have vacancy surveys, things like that, but most of it is pretty lagged by the time you can actually, use it. So I don't put a lot of stock in census rental housing data.
Got it. Okay. I've got some more questions, but I want to kind of open it up to you. If you had any, major takeaways from this survey that either confirmed some intuitions you had or upended some preconceived ideas or anything like that.
Yeah, I think one thing that really jumped out to me, and this is probably, no surprise to most people who are in this industry, is like you look at investor concerns and priorities, a lot of them are around maintenance and upgrading units. And then also the related concern, one of the top 5 priorities was increasing profit margins, because again, those have actually thinned out over the last few years, as you know, Peter. So there's obviously conflicting issues here. It's like we need to generate more profitability. At the same time, we have increasing costs that you're going to defer for so long. And so one of the things I think is a really big challenge across SFR and multifamily is that a lot of the rental housing stock is I mean, it's all getting older, right? But a lot of it was built in the 70s and 80s. That's when we had our last big, massive supply spike in all types of housing. And I don't know the exact numbers, but that's a huge percentage of our rental housing stock. So as these units get old, these homes get older, that's going to create more and more, deferred maintenance needs on top of all the upgrades that, people want in terms of, types of appliances and countertops, et cetera. And I think that's going to be a really, really interesting challenge to watch these next few years, just the condition of these properties and the challenge of getting them. So, I mean, obviously I'm generalizing here, but like, this is going to be a big problem, a big challenge over these next, call it 5-10 years.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, we're seeing that really play out here in Columbus. We have an older housing stock here. Not a lot of new builds or new developments are happening relative to the size of the older homes and apartments. And it is a maintenance nightmare to keep up with all these things. And of course, no one wants to pay to do anything right because it's super expensive and it's doubled in price in the last 5 to 6 years. So definitely seeing that. I also want to get your perspective on, you've got an eye for how the media reports on things and how the public perceives certain storylines and certain threads. And what I wanted to ask you about is like, how are we as an industry shooting ourselves in the foot right now? Like when you think about third-party property managers who are dealing with these mom and pop landlords and small multifamily, like what are some of the lines of thinking that we just need to give up on? What are some of the ways that we're talking about things that are not going to be palatable to legislators or the general public? Like I want to take advantage of your outside perspective and maybe like slightly adjust. Like one of the things you mentioned is like not using the word landlord, right? And I feel like there's maybe some other things like that we are sort of myopic because we're inside it and we're like, to us, this is obvious, but anything coming up for you there?
Yeah. The landlord's a big one, just because, I mean, for those of you who don't know, like this word harkens back to medieval times and, awful things. And so it's not a word that I think anybody should be embracing. And it's certainly not a word that even the industry groups are really using anymore these days. And nor does it really reflect, I think, the reality of what property managers actually do. It's a very different relationship than the medieval concept.
No, it's like the tenant has become the landlord. I mean, they're the ones in charge. If you look at all the recent regulations and laws, and they honestly more pull the strings than we do anymore. Just trying to evict someone for non-payment of rent in California or New York.
Well, yeah, but also it's honestly like this. If you look back to that old model, it's like the cities are really, more their role is more equivalent to the medieval landlord concept. Like a property
Interesting.
owner. Yeah, I mean, a property owner obviously doesn't have unlimited rights to do whatever they want in their property. Like it's very controlled by the city, even in terms of building improvements. I mean, everybody knows. I mean, just trying to do sometimes a renovation, you get a building permit for, which could take forever, just to try to improve something. Your costs go up because you got to pull a permit, and on down the list. And so the real landlord is probably more the city than the owner.
I love that
Now,
framing.
the other thing I would tell you I tell investors all the time, I think in terms of, I like the way you frame the question. I think we need to be very careful how we talk about homeownership, because we're still the nation where homeownership's the American dream. You saw in this election that we just went through, both parties are making a big issue, as you know, and I'm not criticizing. I mean, it's fair game. Is that we need to boost first time home buyers, and so I think I'd be very careful how we talk about rentals in proximity to for sale housing. Like, I don't think it's something to celebrate that homeownership, that first time homebuyers are more challenged. And number one, because it does not a good look. But number two, it's out of the data doesn't back it up. I mean, again, we had a terrible year for home sales last year. And it was kind of an okay year for SFR. It wasn't 2021 when home sales were booming and we had a lot more rental demand. So I would avoid that. And then also too, I think related is I would really be positioning, I think we ought to do a better job positioning rental housing as part of the solution. And really thinking about it as like, hey, these are homes we provide. And I think, we could spend a lot more time on that. But I think the more we think of, we position rental housing as a solution, I think is the better way to do it.
Yeah, Jordan Muela, the co-author on the study here, has a great way of talking about this, where the property manager is kind of like the factory that turns an unusable structure into a home that's ready to move into. And I think critics of landlords and property managers, they kind of try to make it sound like these homes and apartments just exist. It's like, take as a given, all homes and apartments are habitable. It's like, well, wait a minute. There's actually like a lot that goes on to maintaining these structures and keeping them habitable and getting them ready to rent between tenants. There's a ton of work of oversight and management and physical labor that's happening to make this all work. And I think, yeah, just like you said, rental housing is part of the solution, and the people who make that rental housing possible are also part of the solution. These things don't just exist in a vacuum. This isn't like a physics problem where you can just assume there's no friction. It's like, no, I mean, if landlords and property managers cease to exist, we wouldn't have some utopia where everyone could just move into all these vacant homes and it would be into this amazing thing. Everything would instantly start to deteriorate. The lack of contract enforcement would cause chaos and fighting and murders. It would just be mayhem. And so it's like, how can we articulate that in a way that reminds folks like someone's actually keeping these things going? There's a lot more to it than just collecting the rent.
Absolutely. And I'll give you another thing too, is if I mentioned part of the being rental housing part of the solution. I mean, think about this. It's like a lot of people listening to this, that you probably have homes in neighborhoods that are places where people, maybe they could afford to be a home buyer somewhere in your metropolitan area, but not in that neighborhood where they actually want to live.
Yeah.
And so what rental housing really does is it unlocks neighborhoods to people who couldn't otherwise afford or want to, for whatever reason, to be buying in that neighborhood. And so in that way, there's plenty of research on this too. It's like rental housing helps diversify our communities. And that's something that I think that we don't talk about enough, is the role that rental housing plays in kind of in creating a
Sure.
fabric for our communities, both, age and, gender, race, whatever, but also think about like the diversity of, there are some cases, I remember years ago where there's a growing suburb here in Dallas that at the time wasn't really building many apartments and whatnot. And they were all these retail stores opening and whatnot. People were coming in, they were having to pay people more to bring people in to work in these stores and the malls and the restaurants, because they didn't think about the fact that, hey, like rental housing is important for the fabric of our community. Like we need people who can afford to live here in order to have the retail and restaurant amenities that we want.
Yeah. I'm picturing like a national ad campaign, like the Got Milk ad of years gone by, where all the dairy producers got together. We need to get all the rental housing providers together, and we need to run ads that's like rental housing, unlocking neighborhoods, or like some sort of way to highlight some of these positive impacts that rental housing really has on society and on, encouraging diversity within neighborhoods and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I like it.
So let's wrap up by looking forward, casting our eyes forward a little bit. What should property managers expect over the next 4 years? We just had kind of a surprise election back in November. And if I'm putting on my sort of tactical business owner's hat and ignoring my personal feelings, how should I be preparing, or what should I be expecting over the next 4 years as a rental housing provider?
That's a great question. I think the first thing is going to be interesting on the policy side. And I know you say we shouldn't talk about federal policy, but I'll have to
Well,
mention
we'll make an exception now. Yeah.
Yeah. In your great state of Ohio, Senator J.D. Vance is now going to be Vice President Vance. And as a senator, he, as you know, Peter, I'm sure, was very critical of single family rental owners and investors. And he was part of I think a bipartisan group that really, I think, incorrectly labeled any kind of SFR as kind of like Wall Street private equity, yada, yada, yada. People can't afford to buy houses because of rental investors, et cetera. Now, the Trump administration, President Trump has not used that kind of language. And obviously he's a real estate guy. So I don't know that actually takes root, but I think it's something to watch because, again, I think there's some bipartisan alignment, ironically, around misinformation about the industry that that could put a challenge. Because one of the things, and I should point out this too, like when he was senator, he didn't actually endorse this legislation, but the proposed legislation in the Senate would have. I forget the exact rule, but it's like if you own so many homes, then all of a sudden there's severe tax burdens that would encourage you to sell. Now that's not going to pass, I don't think, but it is something to kind of keep an eye on. And that was your other Ohio senator, right? Senator Brown, who sent it got voted out. So I think that's always something to watch. I'm hoping that the supply solution comes more around incentivizing builders to build more more starter homes for first-time buyers. And I think that'll be a win-win for everybody. I hope we do see that. Now, in terms of other things, like I think that the demand side will continue to be solid over the next handful of years. The demographics are very favorable, I think, for both SFR and for multifamily. But on everything we just talked about in terms of the professionalization, Amazonification, like, again, progress doesn't go backward. Like, people are going to expect more and more of this going forward, instant responses, more click of the button, things. I think all of that will only intensify. And then, kind of city side too, like the regulatory environment is probably going to get tougher. So, yeah, I think that, again, demand side's good. I think the affordability story is probably better than most people think. I'm a little more bullish on this than a lot of others. I don't think you're going to have challenges on the affordability side for the most part in most areas. I think demand will be good, but the regulatory environment and technology, I think, are the two things to keep an eye on.
Last question to end the show today. If we reran the survey, say in 2 years, what are some areas that you think would be fruitful to ask about that maybe we didn't this first time around? And what are some areas you think would be fruitful to double click on as we talk to individual mom and pop property owners 2 years from now?
Well, that's a great question. I would like to think about give you a better answer, but I think the first answer, I think, is to better understand how the increased regulatory environment is. I would double click on that, of understanding how that impacts their long-term appetite to be an SFR owner. I think that would be an interesting one, and really understanding too, like what specific things are challenging their business models. But in the regulatory, I'm sure it's different by city, whether it's a PHA or whether it's inspection issues or whatever. I mean, or tax. I don't know what it could be, or just the demonization of property managers, et cetera. And then try to think the other thing I think would be really interesting to really double click on is the maintenance issues, and really understanding that I think the survey I really breaking more detail into like upgrades versus deferred maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
I think better understanding the depth of deferred maintenance in the SFR stock is I think would be a really fascinating issue.
Great. Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you, Jay. I appreciate your time coming on the show and helping me digest this PM Trends report further. For folks who want to follow along with your analysis and shares from the industry, where can they do that?
Well, there's so many platforms, and I feel like I have to get on all of them. So, LinkedIn, Twitter /X, started dabbling into Blue Sky, and I've got a blog or a newsletter at jparsons.com. I'm not too hard to find.
All right. Great. Well, thanks so much, Jay, and I appreciate your time today.
Hey, thanks, Peter.
If you like the show and want to get connected to the community, you can follow me on Twitter @PSLoman and subscribe to my email newsletter on my website, peterloman.com. I try to share as much valuable property management content as I can on a regular basis. Thanks again for listening, and have a great week.